And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
When Donald Trump announced the imposition of 25% tariffs on cars imported into the United States, no one could have predicted the consequences. The move not only severely impacted the economies of the two largest neighbors on the continent, but also opened a new front in the global trade war. Canada, a country with which the US has enjoyed strong economic ties for years, was quick to react to such measures. What followed, however, stunned even the most seasoned analysts.
Hey Diane, this investigation really just beginning, and one of the key elements will of course be the surveillance video, and investigators potentially have a lot of it to work with as they try to figure out what caused this fire. We know that surveillance footage has been turned over, including video from each of the cars, which could prove vital to understanding what happened here, because each vehicle has its own camera system that works even when the car is off, and 16 cars burned in this fire, and right now investigators don't know what caused it.
Protests, boycotts, political threats, economic sanctions all became part of a mosaic that became harder to ignore with each passing day. Mass protests began in Canadian cities. People took to the streets demanding the protection of national interests. In response to US actions, the Canadian government not only announced the creation of a $2 billion strategic fund to support local workers, but also prepared countermeasures that touched virtually every sector of the economy. The strategy was clear: to respond with a blow to the US economy to save face and protect its citizens. But what lies behind these measures? What really is the threat to the economies of both countries? How did tariffs, seemingly so simple and logical at first glance, escalate the conflict and lead to an economic crisis affecting not only Canada, but also the US? And how has the situation affected global relations, as many countries such as France and Australia have begun to openly support Canada in this conflict?
But they are not ruling out the possibility that this was arson. At the same time, as you just mentioned, there are groups that have been organizing ongoing and peaceful protests at Tesla dealerships around the world. These demonstrations targeting Elon Musk and his affiliation with the Trump administration. Italy's prime minister is said to be close friends with Musk, and there were reports that Teslas have been vandalized in her hometown in Italy. Diane.
The steel and aluminum tariffs seem to affect only a few industries, but the effects spread far beyond the auto industry. Material supply problems, rising commodity prices, and resulting mass layoffs in a wide variety of sectors are just the beginning. Finding themselves on the brink of economic collapse, both countries have begun to look for a way out, but the answer to that question has not been easy. How far is Canada willing to go to defend its interests? What hidden threats and opportunities could arise from this trade war? Why has conflict with the US become a matter of not only economic, but also political independence? You'll find the answers to these and many other questions about global trade in this video. Heads up, right now we will break down how this trade clash between the US and Canada could change the future of international politics and economics. Stay tuned for all the details of this tense conflict.
KTLA Samantha Cortese joins us live with more on the wave of vandalism in protest of Elon Musk and his role in Washington. Sam?
Hi, Sharon, Micah. The ATF and FBI are collaborating with federal, state, and local law enforcement to investigate acts of domestic terrorism surrounding Teslas.
When Donald Trump announced in 2018 that he would impose 25% tariffs on cars imported into the US, few could have imagined that the move would have such global repercussions. Although he explained his policy by saying that he intended to protect American jobs and industry, the decision to impose such high tariffs was the beginning of a real economic storm that affected not only the US, but also Canada, its largest trading partner. Soon after the tariffs were announced, tensions between the two countries rose to a fever pitch, and the effects began to be felt in several sectors of the economy at once. At first glance, it would seem that the imposition of tariffs should have been a routine trade move in the spirit of economic warfare, and there was nothing unusual about it. However, in the first weeks it became obvious that this was far from the case. Canadian authorities perceived Trump's decision as a direct threat to national security and the economy. In response, the Canadian government announced that it was preparing an economic response, which soon became known as a protection strategy, a set of solutions aimed at minimizing the damage and creating a new direction for the economy.
Tesla is a peaceful company. We've never done anything harmful. I've never done anything harmful. I've only done productive things. So I think we just have a deranged, there's some kind of mental illness thing going on here, because this doesn't make any sense.
Tariffs on automobiles, especially those brought into the US from Canada, affected one of the most important sectors of both countries' economies. The automotive industry in Canada has historically been one of the leading industries in Canada. For decades, Canada has been able to maintain stable economic ties with the US in this area. Approximately 75% of all vehicles produced in Canada were shipped to the US market, and this provided stability for hundreds of thousands of Canadian workers. However, the decision to impose tariffs threatened the existence of this industry. Canadian businesses began to experience drastic cuts in production, and tens of thousands of workers were threatened with layoffs. In response to such threats, protests against the tariffs swept across major Canadian cities, while politicians on both sides of the border continued to exchange accusations and threats. Demonstrations gathered en masse on the streets of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver to demand protection of national interests and jobs. Protesters shouted angrily that Canada should not be a slave to the American economy and should assert its independence, even if economic sacrifices had to be made to do so. Soon such protests took on the character of not only an economic movement but also a political movement. Independence or death. People demanded that Canada do everything possible to resist economic pressures, even if it resulted in a prolonged economic crisis.
We've accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
He praised all the domestic actions he has taken so far on immigration.
And I deployed the U.S. military and Border Patrol to repel the invasion of our country.
And spending cuts.
We are draining the swamp. It's very simple.
Meanwhile, on the other hand, in the US, where Trump's decision on tariffs was applauded, domestic tensions were rising by the day. First, trade chains, including those between Canada and the US, began to collapse. Small and medium-sized US companies that had previously worked with Canadian manufacturers faced serious problems. Higher component prices, as well as supply disruptions due to the new tariffs, made manufacturing more expensive, which in turn affected the final prices of goods. Massive job cuts began in the US, which in turn led to increased discontent among citizens. The social discontent only intensified when economists began to warn of the possible long-term consequences for the US economy, which could face severe inflation and reduced purchasing power due to the tariff hikes. What was most striking about the conflict, however, was not only the economic but also the political fallout. In response to the tariffs, Canada not only announced a strategic fund to support its workers, but also prepared countermeasures that soon led to the imposition of new taxes and sanctions on American goods. These measures included imposing 30% tariffs on certain US goods, including steel and aluminum, as well as a ban on certain agricultural exports. The move was seen as a serious challenge to the US economy, which, like the Canadian economy, was closely tied to global production chains.
Teslas are being torched across the country. Dealerships shot up and set on fire. Spray paint to vandalize and make a statement. People in Southern California are getting notes on their Teslas, calling them complicit Nazis for owning electric cars.
Numerous analysts' predictions showed that such an economic crisis could be a catalyst for global change. Economists noted that if the trade war continued, the economies of both countries could become hostage to their own decisions. The conflict could cause trade relations between Canada and the US to break down and the production chains that link the two countries to cease to exist. Experts said that the US and Canada could become economically isolated, affecting not only their domestic markets, but also global economic relations. However, the political repercussions were not long in coming. Canadian protests were not limited to domestic unrest. Just weeks after the tariffs were imposed, other countries began to support Canada. Australia, France, Germany, and even the United Kingdom said they were ready to support Canada in this conflict and challenged the US decision in international trade organizations. This not only escalated the trade war, but also caused U.S. relations with a number of key allies to begin to seriously deteriorate.
Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe, including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, "Of course, I'm going to respond." And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs.
Thus, the conflict that began as an economic measure soon escalated into a global trade crisis that affected not only the economies of the two countries, but also political relations on the international stage. Although the world has yet to see the final effects of this crisis, it is clear that its development will influence the future of international politics and world trade for many years to come. After Canada began retaliating against the imposition of U.S. tariffs, the situation quickly escalated, and the two countries entered an active phase of economic warfare. Canada was prepared to do anything to protect its interests, and the government immediately announced the creation of a $2 billion strategic fund that was designed to support domestic workers and industry. This move was not a simple gesture, but rather part of a strategy to resist American pressure. Canada realized that not only economic security but also political independence was at stake. Instead of retreating into economic crisis, as some experts predicted, the country began to develop long-term initiatives that would not only compensate for the damage, but also diversify the economy for the future. In response to growing public discontent and a worsening economic situation, the Canadian government offered a program that would allow businesses to defer taxes and also provide large loan packages. These measures became particularly relevant to small and medium-sized businesses which were on the verge of bankruptcy due to the escalating trade conflict. Just weeks after the tariffs were introduced, other economic initiatives were launched, including incentives for new jobs in sectors such as renewable energy and high technology. The government was confident that this was the only way to not only restore the economy, but also to lead the country to sustainable growth in the long term.
Tesla shares have slumped by more than 9% amid a fall in sales in Europe. The electric vehicle maker posted lower sales across 5 European countries, including France and the UK. Joining us now to discuss this is CBS News foreign correspondent Remy Inocencio. Remy, why do we believe these sales are dropping? What's driving that?
Sure. Well, Errol, basically what Elon Musk has been talking about over the past, say, few months, ever since Donald Trump's election back to the White House, that has been fueling this anger, this frustration. Some even say disgust towards Musk, and they're taking it out on Tesla. Tesla now feeling the pain. But because of what's happening here in Europe, Tesla sales fell by nearly half across the continent just last month, 45%.
Meanwhile, the Canadian side continued to strengthen its position by developing strategies to promote domestic products in international markets. Some countries, such as Australia, France, and the United Kingdom, began to support the Canadian position, fearing that the effects of US policies could negatively impact their economies as well. Canada actively sought new trading partners and aimed to expand its role in global trade. One of the most important steps was to strengthen economic ties with the European Union and Asia. These actions provoked reactions in the international arena when many countries began to realize that such measures could lead to a global redistribution of trade flows and alter existing alliances.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States.
The U.S. reaction to the Canadian countermeasures was predictable, and Trump immediately promised a tough response to his neighbor's economic actions. He stated that the U.S. was ready to impose new tariffs that would be even harsher than those already applied. In addition, Trump began to openly threaten Canada with the possibility of disconnecting from the American system of trade and finance if it did not abandon its policy. The U.S. media actively supported the president, calling the Canadians trade blackmailers and accusing them of trying to undermine the U.S. economy. Economists on both sides raised the alarm, pointing out that against the backdrop of such measures, there was a real threat of a complete breakdown of trade relations between the two countries, which would have a catastrophic impact on both economies. Meanwhile, within the US, public tensions began to rise. Many Americans began to realize that the effects of the trade war were not only affecting Canada, but also their own pockets. Following the rising prices of automobiles and goods dependent on Canadian supplies, mass protests broke out across the country. In major cities like New York and Los Angeles, people took to the streets to demand a review of tariff policies, accusing the Trump administration that its actions would lead to inflation and higher unemployment. American economists also sounded the alarm. Many of them predicted that such a situation could turn into an economic crisis that would affect not only the United States, but also many countries around the world whose economic relations with America are closely intertwined.
Outperforming as well in some cases, doing better than Tesla. And you just have to think, how much more is this a sustained issue for Tesla going forward, given the fact that you have Elon Musk, who's been very forthright in his opinions, particularly weighing in on politics, particularly in Europe. We've just had the European elections, which Musk has been very focused on. But across the piece, when you look at the performance for Tesla in Europe, it's not just in small countries. There are a lot of countries where Tesla has been performing badly, including in Germany, in the UK, where it has been lagging, and Spain as well.
Canada, for its part, was not left out of the political changes. In parallel with economic measures, it has strengthened its position in the international arena, working with various political allies. Canadian diplomats have actively engaged with international organizations to promote their position in forums and conferences. Importantly, support from Europe and other countries also played a role. Despite increasing pressure from the US, Canada was able to not only preserve its economy, but also draw global attention to the issue of undue economic sanctions. Nevertheless, the negative consequences were not long in coming. Canada faced serious challenges from the loss of export markets, disrupted trade chains, and increased social protests. At the same time, the US economy, despite external optimism, began to experience increasing difficulties. US companies faced high production costs, which led to higher commodity prices and reduced competitiveness of US products. Industries such as automobiles and agriculture, where the US was heavily dependent on Canadian supplies, were particularly hard hit.
That's from the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. People just choosing with their wallets to not buy Teslas because of that Musk-Trump association. And actually here in London, an activist group called Everyone Hates Elon actually have been hacking bus stop signs with posters. I actually passed one yesterday. First, I wasn't quite sure what was happening, but it said the words 0 to 1939 in 3 seconds. Illusion here, 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds or something. But this poster was alluding to the start of World War II, and the image was of Musk giving that hand salute that we saw at Trump's inauguration that many have attacked as a Nazi gesture. Musk, though, has neither admitted or denied what he was doing. But we're seeing the knock-on effect of that anti-Musk anger across Europe and in terms of sales.
However, the most important thing that happened was that the economic conflict with Canada became a kind of catalyst for global changes in trade policy. Many countries began to reconsider their relations with the US, and the Canadian experience became an example for other countries that were concerned about the possible consequences of US policy. Against this background, a new reality emerged in the world, where trade wars and sanctions became not only instruments of pressure, but also a reason for rethinking economic strategy. As the trade war between the US and Canada came into full force, questions related to the economic consequences became more pressing. How long would this conflict last? And what will happen to the economies of both countries if trade relations remain broken? Contrary to expectations, many experts began to recognize that the Canadian protections were effective in the short term, but the long-term consequences associated with the economic rupture did not last long.
Well, this feels more like a Tesla-only story when you look at just this fall in EV sales for them, that they're suffering across Europe, down 45% in January. The wider EV market in Europe up 37%, so rivals are catching up and performing.
For Canada, faced with sharply reduced supplies and export markets, beginning to forge new economic ties proved vital. However, Despite attempts to attract new markets and develop independence from the US, the future of the auto industry remained a key issue. Automakers such as Ford and General Motors could not quickly shift to new supply channels, and this caused a crisis in these industries. As a result, dozens of Canadian plants had to close or significantly reduce their capacity, leading to mass layoffs of workers. This process was also aided by a parallel increase in tariffs, which put pressure on industries in both countries. While Canada was able to partially offset job losses with a strategic fund, the decision to support small and medium-sized enterprises was only temporary. The fact that remained unchanged was that the broken trade chains between Canada and the US left long-term economic scars on both economies.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Canada also striking back with new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods, mostly steel and aluminum, but also computers and sporting goods.
Meanwhile, the Canadian government, despite external pressures, did not stop developing its long-term plans to strengthen the national economy. An important part of these efforts was the development of new economic alliances, especially in Europe and Asia. Supportive countries began to cooperate with Canada in mutually beneficial trade agreements to make up for lost supplies from the United States. This allowed Canada to create new trade opportunities with minimal loss to the domestic market. In parallel, Canada actively strengthened ties with developing countries, viewing them as potential trading partners. As a result, despite economic difficulties, Canada was able to stay afloat, creating new opportunities for growth and broadening the horizons for its producers. But uncertainty still loomed on the horizon. Whether the US and Canada would be able to restore their economic ties continued to be an open question. Despite numerous attempts by international mediators to reach an agreement, both countries remained stuck in their positions. With each passing day, it became more and more obvious that the situation could lead to long-term economic isolation for both sides. The situation was further complicated by the fact that some countries began to actively support Canada in its efforts, which only strengthened Canada's position on the international stage. US officials, on the other hand, began to realize that continuing with a policy of increasing tariffs could be more costly than anticipated. Meanwhile, in the US, despite outward confidence in the success of its trade policy, domestic anxiety began to build. The realization that the trade war with Canada was having a devastating effect on the country's economy became increasingly evident. Manufacturing difficulties, rising product prices, and a negative economic outlook for small businesses have all led to a new economic crisis that may not end quickly. On top of that, a campaign criticizing the Trump administration's tariff policies began in the political arena in the United States. All these factors put into question the further fate of the US economy. Against the backdrop of economic instability and rising political tensions in the US and Canada, the question remained open. Would they be able to find a compromise that would avoid an economic catastrophe, or would their relationship continue to deteriorate, leading to even more serious consequences for the global market? The same question was heard in the international arena. How long will this conflict continue and what will be its ultimate goal? Time would tell. But one thing remained clear: the consequences for the economies of both countries would be felt for many years, perhaps even decades.